My husband died from carbon monoxide poisoning because his parents disconnected the detector that had been beeping for months, then made me pay $15,000 for his funeral, while they cried at every meeting until my sister exposed them at church, and they had to sell their cabin to pay me back, but then started stalking me and telling everyone I murdered him. My husband died because of his parents' negligence, and they made me plan his entire funeral while they played the Grieving family. I was 26, married to Garrett for 2 years. We just bought our first house and were talking about kids. Life was perfect until his parents' harmless oversight destroyed everything. Garrett's parents, Regina and Frank, owned a cabin upstate. Every summer, they'd invite the whole family for a week. This year, they'd been renovating. New deck, new hot tub, the works. Frank did most of the work himself to save money, always bragging about his handy skills. The carbon monoxide detector had been beeping for months. Regina mentioned it casually during dinner our first night. Frank had disconnected it because it kept going off for no reason. When I suggested replacing the battery, Frank dismissed my concerns as overthinking. Garrett sided with his dad, saying I worried too much. That night, Garrett died in his sleep. Carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty furnace vent Frank had fixed during renovations. I woke up sick, stumbled outside, and called 911. Garrett never woke up. The paramedic said if the detector had been working, we would have been alerted hours earlier. Garrett would be alive. While I was still in the hospital getting checked for CO poisoning, barely able to think straight from grief and shock, Regina called. Since I was his wife, I'd need to handle funeral planning because she and Frank were too devastated to deal with details. The next week was hell. While processing that my husband was dead because of their negligence, they had me running around town making arrangements. Regina called with demands: service at St. Mary's, White Lilies, expensive casket, reception at Rosewood Manor. Every decision came from them, but every bill came to me. Funeral home, church donation, flowers, catering, venue rental. They'd nod approvingly while I watched my savings disappear. The worst part was watching extended family treat them like primary mourners. Regina sobbed dramatically at every meeting while I robotically wrote checks. Frank held court telling stories about his boy while I filled out paperwork. Regina told relatives how they couldn't handle the business side, praising how strong I was being by taking care of everything. 3 days before the funeral, the bill was over $15,000. I'd emptied our joint account, maxed credit cards, and borrowed from my parents. When the funeral director asked about the outstanding $3,000 venue payment, I broke down completely in his office. That's when my sister Poppy arrived from Seattle. Seeing me collapsed in tears, she demanded to know what was happening. After I explained everything, her face went white with rage. Poppy marched to the church where Regina and Frank were supervising flower arrangements with the whole extended family present, about 25 people. She announced loudly that their son was dead because they'd ignored a carbon monoxide detector for months, and now they were making his widow pay for his funeral while playing victim. The room went silent. Regina started her usual theatrics about grieving. Poppy exploded, pointing out their negligence had culled him, and now they were bankrupting a 26-year-old for their guilt funeral. Frank tried defending themselves, claiming they never asked me to spend so much. Poppy listed every expensive demand they'd made while watching me pay and taking credit for honoring Garrett. Family members looked uncomfortable. Garrett's uncle asked in disbelief if I'd been paying for everything myself. When Poppy confirmed every penny, the tide turned fast. Garrett's aunt looked disgusted, asking Regina how she could do this. Even Frank's brother called it dead wrong. Regina tried damage control, claiming they didn't realize about costs. Poppy cut through the lies. They were too ashamed to face their mistakes' costs, so they dumped it on the person they'd hurt most. The family demanded immediate reimbursement. Frank had to take out a loan against the cabin, the same cabin where Garrett died, to pay me back. The funeral happened differently. Family treated me like the actual widow instead of Regina's assistant. Several relatives apologized privately for not speaking up sooner. 2 months later, I sued for wrongful death, not for money, for justice. The lawsuit revealed Frank had known about CO issues for over a year. We settled out of court. They had to sell the cabin and pay substantially. More importantly, their negligence became public record. Regina called on Garrett's birthday, suggesting we move past this as family. I told her calmly she wasn't my family. My family died because they were too cheap to replace a $20 detector, then made me pay consequences while playing victim. I hung up and blocked their numbers. Unfortunately, getting rid of them wasn't so simple, because they were way too prideful to let me have the last laugh. The next morning, I woke to find my car tires slashed, all 4 of them. My neighbor knocked on my door while I stood in my driveway, staring at the damage. She handed me a note she'd found taped to her mailbox with my name on it. The handwriting was Regina's. I'd seen it on enough funeral planning lists to recognize those dramatic loops. The note read, "You destroyed our family. Now you'll know what loss feels like." I called the police, but without proof Regina had done it herself, they could only file a report. The officer suggested installing security cameras. While waiting for the tow truck, I noticed several neighbors watching from their windows. Word travels fast in small neighborhoods. Poppy drove over immediately when I called. She helped me arrange a rental car and stayed while the repair shop assessed the damage. 4 new tires would cost me $800, money I didn't have after the funeral expenses and legal fees. The settlement money was tied up in escrow for another month. That afternoon, my phone rang constantly. Unknown numbers I didn't answer. Then texts started coming through from family members, Garrett's cousins, his aunts and uncles. Regina had apparently spent the morning calling everyone, spinning a story about how I'd stolen their son's life insurance and left them penniless. She claimed the lawsuit was my scheme to profit from Garrett's death. The messages ranged from disappointed to hostile. Garrett's cousin Beth, who'd been at our wedding, wrote that she couldn't believe I'd be so heartless. His uncle Jim said he was ashamed he'd ever welcomed me into the family. Each message felt like another knife twisting. Poppy grabbed my phone and started responding to each person with facts. Screenshots of the CO detector recall notices, the inspection report showing Frank's faulty repairs, the settlement that barely covered my expenses. Some family members apologized immediately. Others stayed silent. A few doubled down, saying I should have just let it go for family peace. The next few days brought more harassment. Pizza deliveries I hadn't ordered showed up at all hours. My mailbox got stuffed with religious pamphlets about forgiveness. Someone signed me up for dozens of email lists, grief counseling, widow support groups, dating sites for young widows. The cruelty of that last one made me physically sick. Then Regina escalated. She started showing up places she knew I'd be. The grocery store where I shopped every Tuesday, the coffee shop where I worked on my laptop. She'd appear with Frank, both wearing black like they were still in mourning, talking loudly to anyone who'd listen about their ungrateful daughter-in-law who sued them while they grieved. At the grocery store, she cornered me by the produce section. She picked up a photo from her purse, Garrett at his college graduation, beaming at the camera. She held it up, tears streaming down her face, asking how I could do this to her baby. Other shoppers stopped to stare. I abandoned my half-full cart and left. The coffee shop incident was worse. I was meeting with my therapist's referral, a grief counselor who specialized in sudden loss. Regina walked in just as I was explaining how guilty I felt for not insisting harder about the CO detector. She sat at the next table, openly weeping while on the phone, describing how I'd turned her son against them and probably wanted him gone for the insurance money. The counselor suggested we leave. As we walked out, Regina called after me that Garrett would be ashamed of what I'd become. My hands shook so badly I couldn't unlock my car. The counselor had to help me. Poppy wanted me to get a restraining order, but the lawyer said we didn't have enough for one yet. Following me to public places and making scenes wasn't illegal. The slashed tires couldn't be definitively linked to them. The harassment was careful, calculated to cause maximum pain while staying just within legal bounds. My work started suffering. I worked from home as a graphic designer, but the constant interruptions and stress made focusing impossible. Clients complained about missed deadlines. My biggest account threatened to find another designer. The financial pressure mounted just as Regina intended. Then came the memorial ambush. Garrett's grandmother, who lived in a nursing home, called to invite me to a small memorial she'd arranged for his 6-month anniversary. She'd always been kind to me, one of the few family members who'd immediately supported me after Poppy's confrontation. I couldn't say no to her. I should have suspected something when she mentioned Regina had helped with the planning, but grief makes you stupid sometimes. I walked into the nursing home's community room to find not a small memorial, but a full family gathering. 30 people, all wearing buttons with Garrett's photo, all turning to stare as I entered. Regina stood at a makeshift podium, mid-speech about forgiveness and family unity. She smiled when she saw me, not a warm smile but the satisfied smirk of a trap well sprung. My heart goes so much out to this young woman who lost everything because someone couldn't be bothered to fix a simple detector. She announced to the room that I'd come, that maybe there was hope for reconciliation after all. The next hour was torture. Regina had prepared a slideshow of Garrett's life, lingering on every photo of him with his parents. She spoke about raising him, teaching him to ride a bike, sending him to college, how proud they'd been when he got married, how they'd looked forward to grandchildren, how that dream died with him. Then she asked if I'd like to say something. The room waited. Garrett's grandmother looked at me hopefully. I stood on shaking legs and managed to say that I missed him every day. That was all I could get out before the tears came. Regina hugged me in front of everyone, a performance of motherly comfort while she whispered in my ear that this was just the beginning, that I'd taken everything from her, and she'd return the favor. To everyone else, it looked like a touching moment of shared grief. I left immediately after, driving home through tears. Poppy was waiting on my porch with Chinese takeout and a bottle of wine. She'd gotten worried when I didn't answer my phone. I told her about the memorial, about Regina's whispered threat. We stayed up late strategizing, but what could we really do? Regina had turned my grief into a weapon against me. The next morning brought a new horror. Someone had created a Facebook page called Justice for Garrett. It was filled with photos from our wedding, our life together, all stolen from my private social media. The post told a twisted version of our story, how I'd isolated him from his loving parents, forced him to that dangerous cabin, then profited from his death. Comments poured in from strangers who'd found the page. Some offered condolences to Regina and Frank. Others attacked me directly, calling me a gold digger, a black widow, worse things I can't repeat. My own Facebook filled with friend requests from fake profiles, all sending variations of the same message, that I was a murderer who'd gotten away with it. I deactivated all my social media, but the damage was spreading. Screenshots of the page started appearing in local Facebook groups. Someone shared it in the neighborhood association page. My landlord called to say he'd gotten complaints from other tenants who were uncomfortable living near me. Work completely dried up. 2 more clients fired me after discovering the Facebook page. My reputation in the small freelance community I'd built was destroyed overnight. The financial cushion I'd hoped to rebuild evaporated as bills piled up. Poppy tried fighting back online, reporting the page, commenting with truth on every post, but Regina had crafted her narrative carefully. She never explicitly accused me of murder, just posed questions, shared concerns, let others draw conclusions. Facebook found no violation of their policies. Then Frank joined the campaign. He started calling Garrett's old friends, men who'd been groomsmen at our wedding. He told them I'd been planning to leave Garrett, that the cabin trip was supposed to be a reconciliation attempt, that I'd probably known about the CO detector and saw an opportunity. Pure fiction, but delivered by a grieving father, it found receptive ears. One by one, our friend group disappeared. People who'd brought casseroles after Garrett died now crossed the street to avoid me. His best friend Marcus sent a long text about how he couldn't be sure what was true anymore, but he needed distance for his own peace of mind. The isolation felt like drowning in slow motion. I started having panic attacks. The first one hit at the gas station. I thought I saw Frank's truck in the parking lot and couldn't breathe. A stranger had to call 911. The EMTs were kind, but I saw the look between them when they ran my name. They'd seen the Facebook page too. The second attack came at the lawyer's office. We were discussing options for stopping the harassment when his secretary knocked. Regina and Frank were in the waiting room, asking about their own legal options for recovering their son's assets from his killer. The lawyer had to physically block them from entering while I hyperventilated in his bathroom. Poppy moved in with me temporarily. She worked remotely and could afford to take time off, becoming my shield against the world. She answered the door for the constant deliveries. Flowers with condolence cards addressed to Regina, memorial wreaths for Garrett sent to my address, packages of baby clothes with notes about the grandchildren Regina would never have. The breaking point came when Regina found my parents. They lived 3 states away and had been my refuge, somewhere Regina couldn't reach, until she hired a private investigator to track them down. My mother called in tears. Regina had shown up at their church, introducing herself to their entire congregation as the mother of their son-in-law who died because of my negligence. She'd brought photos, the same graduation picture, wedding photos where my parents stood beside Garrett. She told everyone how I'd stolen their son then abandoned them in grief, how I'd taken their money and cut them off from their only connection to him. My parents' pastor had to escort Regina out when she became hysterical. My father, who'd never raised his voice in my life, was furious. Not at me, at them. He wanted to fly out immediately, confront them himself. But what would that accomplish except give Regina more ammunition? Now she could paint my whole family as aggressive, unstable, dangerous. That night, I sat in Garrett's old office, surrounded by his things I couldn't bear to pack away. His coffee mug still sat on the desk. His calendar still showed our anniversary dinner reservation. I found myself talking to him, asking what he'd want me to do, asking if he could see what his parents had become. Poppy found me there at 3 a.m., curled up in his chair. She didn't say anything, just held me while I sobbed. Not just for Garrett anymore, but for the life we'd built that was being systematically destroyed. For the future we'd planned that died twice, once with him, and again with his parents' campaign. The next day, Poppy made a decision. If Regina wanted to play dirty, we'd document everything. Every incident, every witness, every scrap of evidence. She bought security cameras for my apartment, a recording app for my phone, and started building what she called our truth arsenal. We weren't going down without a fight, but I knew Regina and Frank had something I didn't. The perceived moral high ground of grieving parents, and unlimited time to destroy me. The war was just beginning, and I was already exhausted. The security cameras arrived 2 days later. Poppy and I spent the morning installing them at every entrance, making sure they covered my car and mailbox. The recording app on my phone became my constant companion. Every interaction, every encounter got documented. Regina and Frank had no idea we were building a case against them. The first test came sooner than expected. I was picking up groceries when Regina appeared in the cereal aisle. She approached with that fake concerned expression, reaching out to touch my arm. I stepped back, holding my phone casually but recording everything. She launched into a speech about family healing and forgiveness, loud enough for other shoppers to hear. Her performance included dabbing at dry eyes and clutching her chest dramatically. I stayed silent, letting her dig her own grave while the camera captured every theatrical gesture. Frank showed up at my apartment complex that evening. The security footage later showed him trying different keys in my door before giving up and leaving a package. Inside was Garrett's childhood photo album with sticky notes on every picture, each one describing a memory and ending with accusations about how I'd stolen their son's future. The handwriting alternated between Regina's loops and Frank's block letters. Poppy photographed every page before we stored it in our evidence box. My landlord called the next morning. Regina had contacted him directly, expressing concerns about my mental state and suggesting I might be a danger to other tenants. She'd sent him links to the Facebook page and offered to provide character references about my supposed instability. He assured me he wasn't buying it, but warned that other tenants were getting nervous. The whisper campaign was working exactly as Regina intended. 3 nights later, someone keyed my rental car. The security footage showed a figure in dark clothing and a baseball cap, but their face stayed hidden. The scratches spelled out murderer across both sides. The rental company charged me $1,200 for the damage. When I filed another police report, the officer mentioned they'd been getting calls about me from concerned citizens who'd seen the Facebook page. Poppy started sleeping on my couch permanently. She worked from my kitchen table, keeping one eye on her laptop and another on the security monitors. We developed a routine. She'd check the cameras while I tried to salvage what was left of my freelance career. Most nights, we'd review the day's recordings and add them to our growing collection of evidence. The harassment evolved. Regina started sending Garrett's things to my apartment: his high school yearbooks, baby clothes, report cards. Each delivery included notes about the grandchildren she'd never have, the family gatherings he'd never attend. Frank left voicemails from different numbers, describing their empty house and ruined dreams. They never directly threatened me, but the subtext was clear. Then came the ambush at Garrett's grave. I'd been visiting weekly, early mornings when the cemetery was empty. This time, Regina and Frank were waiting. They'd brought flowers and sat by his headstone like grieving parents. When I approached, Regina started wailing about her baby boy. Frank stood up, blocking my path, asking why I needed to be there when I'd caused his death. These people weaponized their own son's resting place. Every detail of their campaign shows such cold planning. The keyed car, the childhood photos with those awful notes, Frank trying different keys. Other visitors started noticing the commotion. Regina collapsed beside the grave, sobbing about how I wouldn't even let them mourn in peace. I stood frozen, phone recording, as Frank accused me of coming there to gloat. A groundskeeper approached, and Regina immediately played the victim, saying I was harassing them at their son's grave. The groundskeeper asked me to leave. I did, shaking with rage and humiliation. The next escalation nearly broke me. Regina found out where I'd been getting coffee with my grief counselor. She started showing up at adjacent tables, always with someone new, a cousin, a family friend, someone she could perform for. She'd cry softly while showing them photos, gesturing in my direction. The counselor suggested meeting at her office instead, but Regina discovered that too. She'd sit in the waiting room, telling other patients her story. My counselor finally had to refer me to a colleague across town. During our last session, she admitted she'd never seen anything like this: the systematic destruction of someone's life through careful legal harassment. She gave me the name of a therapist who specialized in stalking victims and wished me luck. Work became impossible. Every client who hired me got anonymous emails with links to the Facebook page. Regina had created new posts, suggesting I'd been planning Garrett's death for insurance money. She posted photos of our house, claiming I'd forced him to buy it knowing it would stretch our finances. The narrative kept evolving, each version more damaging than the last. Poppy tried to help by reaching out to her network, but the damage was spreading. One potential client told her directly that they couldn't risk associating with someone involved in such a scandal. Truth didn't matter anymore. Regina's story had become the accepted version. The financial pressure mounted. Without steady work, I burned through my savings paying rent and basic expenses. The settlement money remained locked in escrow while lawyers sorted through paperwork. Regina knew exactly what she was doing. Death by 1,000 cuts, each one carefully calculated to avoid legal consequences. Then Frank escalated in a new direction. He started visiting Garrett's old workplace, telling former colleagues I'd isolated Garrett from his friends. He brought photos from their family gatherings, pointing out how I'd supposedly kept Garrett from attending. Complete fabrications, but delivered with a grieving father's conviction. Garrett's former boss called to say Frank had been making scenes in their lobby. One morning, I woke to find my apartment door covered in printed screenshots from the Facebook page. Every accusation, every twisted story, taped up for all my neighbors to see. The security footage showed someone in a hoodie, but once again, their face stayed hidden. By the time I got them down, several neighbors had already seen them. The looks I got in the hallway changed from sympathy to suspicion. Regina's masterstroke came through Garrett's cousin Sarah. She called one evening sounding genuinely concerned. She said the family was worried about the situation escalating and wanted to arrange a mediation. Just family, no lawyers, to work things out. Despite Poppy's warnings, I agreed. The isolation was wearing me down, and part of me desperately wanted this to end. The meeting was at Sarah's house. I arrived to find not just immediate family but dozens of relatives, all wearing those buttons with Garrett's photo. Regina sat in the center like a grieving queen, Frank beside her. They'd prepared a presentation, photos of Garrett growing up, home videos, report cards, everything designed to show what they'd lost. When my turn came to speak, I tried explaining the truth. The carbon monoxide detector, the funeral costs, the harassment. Regina interrupted constantly, twisting every word. When I mentioned the slashed tires, she gasped and suggested I'd done it myself for attention. When I brought up the Facebook page, she claimed it was created by concerned family members, not her. The room turned hostile. Relatives who'd been neutral now looked at me with disgust. Someone suggested I should pay Regina and Frank damages for the pain I'd caused. Another said I should sign over any remaining life insurance. Sarah, who'd seemed sympathetic on the phone, now acted like she'd been deceived. The whole thing had been orchestrated. I left when they started discussing whether I should be allowed to keep Garrett's belongings. Poppy was waiting in the parking lot. She'd insisted on driving me and staying close. On the way home, I finally broke down completely. Not just tears, but body-shaking sobs that left me gasping. The systematic destruction of my life was working exactly as Regina planned. The next phase involved Garrett's childhood friends. People who hadn't been close to him in years suddenly started reaching out. Each one had been contacted by Regina or Frank, fed stories about our marriage. They called with concerns about things that never happened. One insisted Garrett had confided fears about me. Another claimed he'd mentioned divorce. All lies, but delivered with such conviction that I started questioning my own memories. Poppy fought back however she could. She created a website documenting the truth with evidence, the inspection reports, the CO detector recalls, screenshots of Regina's demands during funeral planning. But for every person who saw it, 10 more had already seen Regina's Facebook page. The truth was losing to a better told lie. My parents flew out despite my protests. They'd had enough of watching their daughter be destroyed from afar. My father, usually gentle and soft-spoken, was furious. He wanted to confront Regina and Frank directly. My mother, ever practical, focused on helping me find new work and stability. Their presence helped, but it also gave Regina new targets. She started calling my parents' hotel at all hours. She sent flowers to their room with cards reading, "From your daughter's victim." She had pizza delivered with notes about the grandchildren my parents would never have because I'd called their father. My mother handled it with grace, but I saw how it wore on them. The breaking point approached when Regina discovered my new therapist. She didn't just show up this time. She booked the appointment slot right before mine. I arrived to find her in the waiting room, telling the receptionist about her son's death and his widow's cruelty. When I tried to enter my therapist's office, Regina blocked the door, asking loudly why I was stalking her now. The therapist had to call building security. Regina played the victim perfectly, claiming I'd followed her there. Security reviewed the appointment books and realized what had happened, but the damage was done. Other patients stared at me with suspicion. The therapist apologetically suggested we might need to find yet another arrangement. That night, Poppy and I sat surrounded by boxes of evidence. Printed emails, security footage, recordings, witness statements. We had proof of everything, but what good was it? Regina and Frank had turned my life into a war of attrition, and they were winning. Every small victory we achieved got overwhelmed by 10 new attacks. My laptop dinged with an email notification. Another client canceling their contract after learning about my situation. I closed the computer and looked at Poppy. We both knew something had to change. The defensive strategy wasn't working. If we wanted to survive this, we'd have to go on the offensive. Poppy pulled out her phone and started making calls. She reached out to a journalist friend who specialized in human interest stories, then a social media expert who knew how to combat online harassment. Finally, a family law attorney who dealt with similar cases. If Regina wanted a war, we'd give her one. The security camera alert went off. On the monitor, we watched Frank spray painting something on my car. This time, he'd gotten sloppy. His face was clearly visible in the footage. Poppy smiled grimly as she saved the file. We finally had something concrete. I thought about Garrett that night, wondering what he'd think of all this. Would he be horrified by his parents' behavior? Or would he still defend them, make excuses, take their side like he had with the carbon monoxide detector? I'd never know. But I did know he wouldn't want me destroyed like this. Whatever complicated feelings he'd had about his parents, he'd loved me. That had to count for something. The next morning brought a new development. Several family members who'd been at Sarah's ambush called to apologize. They'd gone home and researched on their own, finding Poppy's website and the evidence we'd compiled. The cracks in Regina's narrative were starting to show. Not everyone was buying it anymore, but Regina wasn't done. If anything, the defections made her more determined. The harassment intensified, the attacks became more personal. She started targeting my friends, my extended network, anyone who might support me. The war was escalating, and I knew something would have to give soon. Looking at the evidence boxes, the security footage, the growing list of witnesses, I realized we were approaching something. Not quite the end, but a turning point. Regina and Frank had spent months destroying my life, but they'd also been documenting their own cruelty. Every attack they made added to our arsenal. Poppy's phone rang. The journalist wanted to meet. The social media expert had ideas. The lawyer saw potential legal avenues we hadn't considered. For the first time in months, I felt something other than despair. Not quite hope, but determination. Regina and Frank had taken everything from me. My husband, my reputation, my peace. But they'd made one mistake. They'd left me with nothing left to lose. The war wasn't over. If anything, it was about to intensify. But for the first time since Garrett's death, I was ready to fight back properly. Regina's timing with the therapy appointments shows real dedication to being awful. Most people can't even remember their own appointments. But she's out here booking sessions just to ambush her daughter-in-law in waiting rooms. Not just defend or document, but take the battle to them. Regina wanted to destroy me completely. She'd have to work harder for it. The journalist meeting happened 3 days later at a small diner downtown. Poppy and I arrived early, reviewing our evidence one last time. The reporter, Catherine, listened intently as we laid out everything. The CO detector, the funeral costs, the systematic harassment. She examined our documentation, asked pointed questions, and took careful notes. Her interest peaked when we showed her Frank's spray painting footage. She explained that while personal vendettas rarely made headlines, documented harassment campaigns with clear evidence sometimes caught local attention. She'd need to verify everything independently first. That evening, Regina struck again. My neighbor knocked frantically. Someone had scattered nails across my designated parking spot. The security footage showed a hooded figure, but this time they'd made a mistake. Their car's license plate was partially visible in the corner frame. Poppy enhanced the image until we could make out 3 digits. Not enough for identification, but progress. The social media expert arrived the next morning. She analyzed Regina's Facebook page with professional precision, identifying patterns in posting times, language choices, and engagement tactics. She helped us create counter-narratives on local community boards, carefully worded to avoid defamation while presenting facts. Within hours, people started questioning Regina's version of events. Comments appeared asking for proof of her claims. Some recognized the harassment patterns from their own experiences. Frank responded by visiting my apartment building during business hours. He cornered residents in the lobby, showing them printed screenshots and asking if they felt safe living near me. The building manager intervened when complaints started pouring in. Security footage showed Frank refusing to leave until threatened with police involvement. Another piece of evidence for our growing collection. My parents extended their stay despite my protests. My mother organized my finances while my father researched legal options. They discovered Regina and Frank had been calling my extended family, aunts, uncles, cousins I hadn't spoken to in years. Each received the same story about their niece, the murderer. Some believed it. Others called my parents for clarification. The family divide deepened, but truth was gaining ground. Catherine called with follow-up questions. She'd verified the CO detector recalls, spoken to the funeral director, and confirmed the lawsuit details. Her editor showed interest but wanted more concrete evidence of ongoing harassment. We provided the spray painting footage, the parking spot nails, the therapy appointment ambush. She said she'd pitch it as a human interest piece about grief and family conflict. Regina's next move targeted my few remaining clients. She created fake review profiles, leaving detailed negative feedback about my work ethic and mental stability. Each review mentioned her son's death, painting me as unstable and dangerous. The platforms required days to investigate and remove them, but the damage accumulated. My last steady client reluctantly ended our contract, citing the controversy. Poppy suggested we go fully offensive. Using the enhanced parking footage, she identified 3 possible car models matching the partial plate. Cross-referencing with Regina and Frank's known associates, we narrowed it to a vehicle registered to Regina's nephew. We'd connected him directly to the vandalism. The lawyer said it was enough for a police report with real teeth. The police took our enhanced footage seriously this time. The detective assigned to our case reviewed months of documentation, finally seeing the pattern. He couldn't promise arrests, but would investigate the nephew's involvement. Word of the investigation reached Regina through family channels. The harassment paused for 2 whole days, the longest break in months. Catherine's article draft arrived for our review. She'd crafted a balanced piece about family conflicts after tragedy, using our story as the centerpiece while protecting identities. She'd interviewed grief counselors, legal experts, and family therapists about harassment patterns. The article wouldn't name Regina and Frank directly, but would describe their behavior in detail. Publication was set for the following week. Regina must have sensed the tide turning. She organized another family gathering, this time at her house. Poppy and I learned about it from Beth, Garrett's cousin who'd initially attacked me but later apologized. She called to warn us that Regina was planning something big, a final push to turn the entire family against me permanently. We decided to attend uninvited. Poppy suggested we arrive after Regina's presentation, when emotions would be highest. We prepared packets of evidence, the inspection reports, the CO detector documentation, screenshots of harassment, the police reports, 30 copies, one for every family member likely to attend. The night of the gathering, we parked down the street and waited. Through Regina's living room window, we could see the family assembled, watching another slideshow. We gave her 45 minutes to make her case before walking to the front door. My hands shook as I rang the doorbell. Frank answered, his face cycling through surprise, anger, and calculation. He tried to close the door, but Poppy's foot was already blocking it. We pushed past him into the living room where Regina stood mid-sentence, remote control in hand. The room fell silent as 30 pairs of eyes turned to us. I didn't speak. Instead, I started handing out evidence packets. Regina tried to stop me, grabbing at the papers, but family members were already opening them. The inspection report clearly showing Frank's faulty repairs. The CO detector recall notices dated months before Garrett's death. Bank statements showing I'd paid every funeral expense. Screenshots of the Facebook harassment, the police reports, the spray painting footage with Frank's face clearly visible. The room erupted. Family members confronted Regina and Frank with specific evidence. Why had they ignored the recall notices? How could they make me pay for the funeral? What kind of parents vandalized their daughter-in-law's property? Regina's theatrical tears couldn't compete with documented facts. Frank's blustering denials crumbled against video evidence. Garrett's grandmother, who'd been sitting quietly in the corner, stood up slowly. She walked to Regina, took the remote control from her hand, and turned off the slideshow. In a voice everyone strained to hear, she said she was ashamed of what her son and daughter-in-law had become. She'd lost her grandson to their negligence and watched them torture his widow. She was done enabling them. The family exodus began immediately. Relatives who'd supported Regina and Frank for months suddenly remembered other commitments. Those who'd been neutral chose sides decisively. By the time the room cleared, only Regina, Frank, and a handful of their most loyal supporters remained. The war was effectively over. Catherine's article published 3 days later. While it didn't mention names, anyone familiar with the situation recognized the story. Local Facebook groups buzzed with discussions about family harassment and grief exploitation. Several people shared their own similar experiences. Regina's carefully crafted narrative finally faced public scrutiny. The police investigation concluded a week later. The nephew received charges for vandalism based on our enhanced footage. Frank faced additional charges for the spray painting incident. Neither would serve jail time, but the arrests became part of public record. Their reputations in our small community were permanently damaged. Regina made one last attempt at contact. She sent a letter through her lawyer proposing a mutual non-contact agreement. The terms were simple. We'd stop pursuing legal action if they'd leave me alone permanently. Poppy and I laughed at the audacity, but we agreed. I wanted peace more than revenge. The settlement money finally cleared escrow. Combined with insurance payouts I'd forgotten about in the chaos, I had enough to start over. Not wealthy, but stable. I paid back my parents, settled my debts, and had breathing room for the first time in months. Work slowly returned as the controversy faded. Former clients reached out with small projects, testing the waters. New clients appeared who'd never heard of the drama. My portfolio spoke louder than old Facebook posts. Within 2 months, I'd rebuilt half my previous income. Poppy moved back to her own apartment but remained close. We'd forged an unbreakable bond through the battle. She'd saved me when I couldn't save myself, and I'd never forget that. We met weekly for coffee, no longer strategizing, but simply enjoying each other's company. The family relationships sorted themselves naturally. Those who'd seen through Regina's lies became closer friends. Those who'd believed her faded away. I found myself with a smaller but more genuine support network. Quality over quantity, as Garrett used to say. On the 1-year anniversary of Garrett's death, I visited his grave alone for the first time in months. No ambushes, no confrontations, just quiet grief. I told him about everything that had happened, how his parents' war had finally ended. I hoped he'd understand why I'd fought back. I hoped he'd be proud that I'd survived. Moving forward meant accepting that Regina and Frank would always exist in my periphery. We lived in the same town, shared some family connections, but their power over me had ended. They'd lost their son, their reputation, and most of their family. I'd lost my husband, but kept my dignity and truth. I started seeing a new therapist, one Regina didn't know about. Seeing the grandmother stand up for truth after all that time must have felt like such a powerful moment of validation. We worked on processing not just Garrett's death, but the trauma that followed. Healing wasn't linear. Some days were harder than others, but each week brought small improvements. I learned to sleep without checking security cameras. I stopped flinching when someone approached me in public. 6 months after the final confrontation, I ran into Sarah at the farmer's market. She apologized again for the ambush, explaining how Regina had manipulated her. We talked for an hour, sharing memories of Garrett that had nothing to do with his parents. It felt like reclaiming pieces of him they'd tried to steal. The Facebook page still existed but gathered dust. Regina occasionally posted, but without an audience, her performance lost meaning. The comment section remained empty. Her narrative had collapsed, and no amount of dramatic posts could rebuild it. I kept the evidence boxes in storage, hoping never to need them again. They represented the worst year of my life, but also my survival. Poppy suggested burning them ceremonially, but I wasn't ready. Maybe someday, when the memories hurt less. Life settled into new rhythms. Work, therapy, time with family who'd stood by me. I dated occasionally, but wasn't ready for anything serious. Garrett's shadow was still too present. His parents' war too recent. But I was learning to be alone without being lonely. The house Garrett and I bought together sold after sitting on the market for months. Too many memories, too much pain. I found a smaller apartment across town, somewhere Regina and Frank had no associations. It felt like breathing clean air after months of smoke. My parents visited regularly now, their protective instincts still heightened. They'd seen their daughter nearly destroyed and weren't taking chances. I appreciated their concern while gently establishing boundaries. I was healing, but not helpless. Poppy got promoted at work, partly because she'd proven her crisis management skills during our war. She joked that Regina and Frank had inadvertently advanced her career. We could laugh about some of it now, though other parts might never be funny. The anniversary of the settlement brought unexpected peace. A full year had passed since Regina and Frank signed the non-contact agreement. They'd honored it, whether from legal fear or exhaustion. I walked through town without scanning for their faces. I shopped without checking over my shoulder. I returned to Garrett's grave on a quiet Sunday morning. Fresh flowers lay there, not from me. The arrangement looked expensive, the kind Regina would choose, but she was nowhere in sight. Perhaps she visited at different times now, finally respecting boundaries. Or perhaps someone else remembered him. I added my own flowers and left. My new normal wasn't what I'd planned at 26. Young widow, harassment survivor, family warrior, but I'd learned strength I never knew existed. Regina and Frank had tried to destroy me with grief and lies. Instead, they'd forged me into someone who could withstand anything. I thought about Garrett less often now, though never a day passed without some memory. The sharp pain had dulled to a persistent ache. I could remember our good times without immediately thinking of his parents' war. He was becoming mine again, not theirs. The last box of his things went to charity. Keeping everything had felt necessary during the battle, proof of my right to grieve. Now it just felt heavy. I kept a few precious items: his watch, our wedding album, the coffee mug from his desk. The rest could help others. Regina and Frank became cautionary tales in our community. Parents who'd lost a son through negligence, then lost everything else through vengeance. Their cabin never sold, sitting empty as a monument to their choices. The CO detector recall notice probably still lay in a drawer somewhere, unheeded twice over. I sometimes wondered if they regretted it. Not just Garrett's death, but everything after. The war that cost them family, reputation, peace. But wondering changed nothing. They'd chosen their path, and I'd survived it. My story spread quietly through grief support networks. Others facing similar harassment found hope in my survival. I spoke at a few meetings, sharing what I'd learned about documentation, support systems, and fighting back. If my pain could prevent others, it meant something. The future stretched ahead, uncertain, but no longer terrifying. I had work, family, friends who'd proven their loyalty. The settlement money provided security. Therapy gave me tools. Time offered perspective. Regina and Frank had taken my husband, but not my life. On quiet evenings, I'd sit on my new balcony, watching the sunset over unfamiliar rooftops. No security cameras needed here. No fear of ambushes or vandalism. Just peace, hard-won and precious. The war was over. I'd survived. And despite everything they tried to take, I was still here. Thanks for reading this story with me. I hope you have a wonderful day.